Welcome back. So I put my glasses on. That means we're getting into kind of more nerdy sort of material. We're going to talk a little bit about uncertainty. And so this ties closely to climate change. It ties to a lot of other kind of environmental topics. Uncertainty is this idea that we don't know what's going to happen. And that is true for short-term stuff. There's a spill of some nasty chemical into a tributary to the Kentucky River. What is that chemical going to do as it makes its way into the Kentucky River and as that makes its way to the Ohio? How far is that plume going to travel? Will it still be nasty once it's diluted a bunch? How many fish is it going to kill? We often don't know, right? We can make guesses, but there's a lot of uncertainty. This stuff is complicated. We have engineers and scientists who study it, but it's still really tough to model and it's complicated. And that's a short-term uncertainty. We're talking about within the next 3 or 4 days, that chemical might make its way 100, 200 miles in the water system. We also have uncertainty that's much more long-term. So climate change is a great example of that. Most of the really serious effects of climate change that we expect to happen are happening 50, 100 years from now. So we obviously don't know what things are going to look like 50 or 100 years from now, so there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to that. So uncertainty is really important for understanding not only environmental economics, how do we weigh the cost and benefits of doing things to prevent this pollution or to stop that chemical from making its way out of the tributary or preventing climate change or adapting to it. It's important for that, but it's also important for understanding the moral issues that come up because of environmental issues and market systems and capitalism. So what do I mean by that? Well, I mentioned cost-benefit analysis. This idea of weighing cost and benefits against each other is kind of the central piece, the most important tool for an environmental economist. It's almost always a tool that is used with uncertainty involved. So we don't know what the benefits are going to be of reducing nitrous oxide air pollution. We can guess, but we don't know. What is it going to cost us to reduce that nitrous oxide air pollution? Well, again, we can guess, but we don't know. We have uncertainty on both sides, and maybe there's more uncertainty on one than the other. Very often, there's a lot of uncertainty on the benefit side of reducing pollution because there's this kind of complex chain. We have a factory that releases a pollutant. It mixes with other stuff, including other pollutants, and then people may or may not get exposed to it in direct ways. If they do, it may or may not cause harm that we see. And so it's tricky because a lot of pollutants cause harms like cancer, which is nasty stuff. It has a latency period, so we don't see it right away. Even if we're talking about something like, a pretty heavy dose of radiation or something, we know that that causes cancer. But we usually don't see it right away. There's radiation sickness that you can get immediately from being exposed to huge amounts of radiation. But if you're getting cancer from radiation, it may show up in 6 months or a year or 2 years. But there is a latency period. And very often, if we're talking about some chemical in the drinking water, we're talking about 10 years from now, or maybe even the next generation is where we really see it, right? So there's a lot of uncertainty there. How much are we going to benefit by reducing pollution? Well, there's this complicated causal chain that we kind of have to follow to say it in a deterministic and a definitive way. We usually can't do that. We say that with uncertainty because we don't know exactly what would happen. And so that makes it tough when we're looking at the moral issues that come up. How do we factor in that we don't know? And so should we think about this risk element? Should we have people who are in a better position be the ones who are facing risk because they're more likely to have resources? So that's one argument that you often see. It's almost like an insurance function. Should rich countries bear more of the risk from something because they're more likely to be able to handle it if it happens than, say, poor countries or poor people within one country? We often see the opposite. when it comes to things like pollution exposure. The environmental justice movement is all about this idea that exposure to environmental pollution is not equitable. In fact, the poor, the racial minority, the recent immigrant, non-English speaking populations, these are the populations that actually are exposed to the highest levels of pollution. They're the ones who are in the worst position to be able to deal with it, both from an economic resource standpoint and from a political standpoint, being able to advocate for their own interests. So environmental justice movement is trying to give voice for these people to help address at least that political element, to say, hey, they may not be able to advocate effectively for themselves because of their situation. We should be a voice for them. Again, it's contentious. So this is at the heart of what we want to talk about in a class like this is, when we have benefits that are uncertain, costs that are perhaps uncertain as well, how do we think about where those costs and benefits should be focused? Where do we see that when we let the markets do their own thing? Where might we want governments to intervene? So there's some good stuff in our chapter for environmental moral issues. The additional readings are supposed to kind of help us think a little bit more, hit the nail on the head with some of these economic market-based sort of topics that come up, like environmental justice, maybe thinking about the housing market. Where are people able to afford rental properties? And if people can only afford to rent in neighborhoods that are polluted, what is that saying about social choices that we're making, and what might we want to do differently, or keep doing as is? So we'll leave it at that for now. I'll keep the glasses on for the next talk, which is another slightly wonky topic about valuing changes in risk levels and putting dollar signs on expected lives that we might save.